بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Alhamdulillah, we've reached chapter 8. Who can give me a summary of what we've been talking about up until this point? Walaikum salam.
The heart?
Huh? We've been talking about the heart? Allahu Akbar. That's excellent summary. What else? I'm sorry, you can move that bag, Iffy. If you want to move that bag, you can move it. Huh? We've been talking about character. In the connection of character to what? And I think which is an important connection that Ghazāli makes, I haven't seen too many people make. Okay, which is connected to what? Taqwa, ahsant. Right? So he links very closely khuluq and taqwa. How?
Our actions, how we behave with creation.
Right. So how we actually deal with other people, because he even says khuluq is what? That khuluq is mu'amala. Khuluq is how we deal with each other, how we deal with others. Right? So it's something very important to keep in mind, and he connects that directly to taqwa. Taqwa is our awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says that awareness should only further encourage and further influence our taqwa and our dealing with Allah. Because the better our dealing with each other, it means the better our dealing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So one of the first things that it's important to keep in mind is the ability or that readiness to change, or that desire to change. He says that this is something that is extremely fundamental. This is something that is extremely important. This is the first step. The want and the desire to change is the first step in order to help ourselves and to make ourselves better. He says once we're on that point, or once we get to that point, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses us with insight. What is insight?
Knowing what's wrong.
Okay, knowing what's wrong with who? With others?
Internally.
Huh? Internally, right? So it actually gives us the ability to look internally. And he's saying that insight, with that insight comes a removal of the veil and the show of remedies. Right? Because, and what do I need to do? What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expect from me? In this entire chart, what am I expected from my internal actions? What does Allah want from me?
Walk with myself.
All right. All he wants from me is this readiness. That's it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all he wants from me is to be willing to accept. And once I open my heart and I have that acceptance, what happens? Allah will then bless me with insight. And what is that insight for? To determine remedies. Remedies for what?
Impurities.
Impurities where? In my water?
Yeah.
In my heart. Then what are some of the impurities of the heart that Ghazāli talks about, or that we've spoken about? Envy. Greed. Laziness. Ahsant. Cowardice. Right? All of these things. Being a spendthrift, right? The opposite of being greedy. Being a spendthrift, a person who just throws his money away. He said all of these are vices of the heart that need to be controlled. And the only way to do that is through bringing remedies. And what are some remedies that he's recommended previously? So if I'm extremely stingy, what did he say to do? Right? He says do the complete opposite. So if I'm stingy, the complete opposite of that would be to keep giving. And at what point do I stop giving? Like when I'm broke? At what point do I stop giving?
Are excessively doing that?
All right, when you get to a point of excess. Why is it important that I reach a point of excess? So I can dial it back. Right, so I can reset my personal meter. Because we said bringing or being at the center of that meter, why is it so important to keep that meter centered?
Balance.
All right, balance. Why is it important to have that balance? We said that the middle point is at what, actually? That he says that this is the Sirat al-Mustaqim, and maintaining it is challenging. So he says maintaining that Sirat is challenging, but why is it important to be on that middle way? We said what about the middle in comparison to the two edges, or the two ends? Right, it's between the two extremes, and those two extremes, the middle of it is what? It is the furthest from those two extremes. And that's something that's extremely important to keep in mind. The next thing, he says faith versus knowledge. Which one of these is the first step and which one of these is the second step? Does faith is it like, is it the chicken or the egg? Is knowledge the first, or is faith the first?
Faith.
Faith is first. Okay,
Different.
it's different for people, per individual. Both, same time. So Ghazāli actually mentions that faith comes first. Why? Because faith is fundamentally founded on belief. What brings a person to belief? Right? So again, it's the chicken or the egg, right? which came first? And the reason he mentions this, and we'll get to it, inshallah, right? Because sometimes this might not seem particularly intuitive. The reasons he mentions this is this verse. يَرْفَعُ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَأُوتُوا الْعِلْمَ دَرَجَاتٍ. And he says the reason for this is when an individual comes to faith, then at that point when he starts seeking knowledge, what does Allah do with him? Right? He starts elevating him. And he starts raising his rank. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about raising these individuals up who believe and have been given knowledge. And he's fully aware of what you do. So an example, he gives the example that one may believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the way to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala involves absolving oneself of desires. Now this is Ghazāli. When he says removing the desires, what did we say that meant? Can I remove my desires? Right, taking control of them and channeling them, right? So this is what he means when he's talking about removing them. It's taking control of them and channeling them, but he might not understand the reason for those desires. Why is it important to understand the source of those desires or the reasoning for them?
To give them direction.
Not just to get better direction, but if I understand the source of those desires, what can I do? Right, it becomes easier to extinguish them. It becomes easier to fix them. So he says faith is like the one who believes, right? Faith is the one who believes. He said, but the knowledge is the one who understands. And this is how he differentiates between them. So again, like I said, it might not seem so intuitive, but the reason he mentions it is because of how it's approached, right? How knowledge is dealt with, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates those levels, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opens up an individual's heart so that he can see what those remedies are, so that he can see how he can fix those personal ills. That all of us suffer in some way, shape, or form from some type of cowardice. We suffer from some type of dishonesty. Some of us are untrustworthy. Some of us are greedy. Some of us are spendthrifts. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created for us and given us the path to rectify all of those ills of the heart, and how to reset that meter that we've been talking about and bring us back to the Sirat al-Mustaqim. So Sufyan al-Thawri, there's a whole bunch of statements and there's a whole bunch of aqwal that Imam Ghazāli brings at this point. I think maybe we'll read a couple of them because I like them. But this one really stood out for me. He said, Sufyan al-Thawri said, you guys know Sufyan al-Thawri? Who is he? Can you tell me some of his famous students? No one?
Ahmad.
Imam Ahmad, one of his famous students. Who else got the opportunity to study with him? No, it wasn't just Ahmad, but also Imam. Shafi, I think it was his contemporary. I don't think he was a student. So Ahmad sat with him, and also Imam Bukhari. All right, so very famous scholar of hadith. He said, never have I dealt with anything more difficult than my soul, than my nafs, which sometimes help me and sometimes opposes me. Does it sound familiar? Right, this is something that, right, it's something that we all suffer from. But what do you think about this statement? You think there's any truth to it?
Absolute truth.
Absolute truth. In what way?
It's a lifelong struggle.
That's basically what he's saying. He's like, my struggle against my soul is something that is going to be lifelong. Is there ever a point where I conquer my soul?
No.
Right. There's no point for that. At what point do I stop fighting my soul? Either when I'm dead or what? When I stop fighting it. What happens when I stop fighting? Right, then my nafs overtakes me. Then my nafs overtakes me. At that point, I've fallen completely into my shahwa, in my desires. But like I said, there's a whole bunch of statements here at this point in the book. I really suggest you guys like just go and take a look at them. They're really, really nice. They're really, really nice statements. They're great encouragements. It talks about the different types of people, like, you know, and there are a bunch of aqwal on how to deal with greed, how to deal with avarice, you know, how to deal with a lot of these things. And they're really nice, inshallah. So there, I tried to make a summary of a lot of what the statements were. One of them is denying the soul of its whims and desires is an obligation. This is something that many of them push toward, many of them push for. How can I do that? What are some things that we desire naturally? Right, food. But even within food, there's a spectrum. I'm sorry, Mahdi, can you just hit admit? Even within food, there's a spectrum. So what type of food should I deny myself from?
Tasty food, delicious, succulent food.
All right, so the food that's extremely delicious, who defines what is delicious and what's not? Right, this is an individual, right? This is individual because everybody has a different palate. There are different things that different people enjoy. And it's very important for me to deny myself from that. Why do you think that is? If I really enjoy hot stone pizza, for example, I shouldn't eat there. Why?
Discipline your soul.
Right, because this is a way for me to discipline myself and to discipline my soul. What are some other ways that I can discipline myself? If I really enjoy sleeping, what should I do? I should not sleep at all, right? I'm sorry? I should sleep less, right? Because again, the idea is to reset the meter, right? And to go from one extreme to another so that we can come back to the middle. And it's important to learn how we deprive ourselves of these certain things and of these things that we strive for or things that we enjoy. Because if I'm able to stop myself, even the things like, what is a good example of this? What is something that we're obligated to do? Fasting. And what does fasting do? It forces us to deprive ourselves of what? Those things which Allah has made, not prohibited, halal. So if the reason for that training is if I can stop myself for the things that are halal, it should be that much easier to stop myself for things that are haram. So again, it's a training. And these steps in these ways are ways, you know, again, for me to better my heart, to better myself, to learn how to really control my nafs. Does this need to happen constantly? And if I enjoy a certain type of food, should I avoid it in my entire life? No. What if I do? Right? That's going into one end. But this person, what is his mentality going to be? Why is he thinking like that? He's like, if I deny myself of it in this world, maybe I will get it in the next. Why is that? Is that correct or is that flawed?
It's flawed.
Why is it flawed?
Islam is like against monasticism and like self mortification.
So like it's like a personal abuse, right? To deny yourself. Okay, it's about balance. Okay, I mean, I agree about all those things, but how do we, setting that balance, sometimes we have to push our meter, right? Because my concept of indulgence right now, do you think my gauge for indulgence is good? Like on a personal level? I mean, you guys don't really know me, but I just meant like the general me. Is my gauge for indulgence appropriate as it is right now? And this is something we need to ask ourselves. Do I know when I am actually depriving myself? And I want all of us to think about that, because for some of us, if I say, you know, having a chicken leg is depriving myself, because usually I eat chicken and the thigh, right? I eat the leg thigh and I'll have some rice and some other decadence with it. But if we think about that in a more subjective way or in a more objective way, have I really deprived myself if I'm just eating that chicken leg? You guys see where, because someone might be like, okay, well, no, and you need to push that a little bit more, and you should only eat plain rice. Someone might push that a little bit more and be like, no, you just need to have a piece of toast. Some might push that even further and be like, no, you only actually need water to survive. So our personal gauges for indulgence are skewed. They are. The way that they are skewed because we've all been living our lives doing what? Indulging ourselves. We're soft. Right? Isn't that what everybody complains about, right? And this is something that we complain about with this generation, right? That they're overindulgent. What does that lead to?
Being soft.
All right, what does being soft mean?
Weak.
Okay, what does being weak mean? Like I can like push them and they like fall over. No, what does it mean to be soft and weak? Yes.
No discipline.
All right, this person has no discipline. They have no self-control. Well, and that person becomes very impulsive. So when it comes time for choosing a job, when it comes time for choosing a spouse, when it comes time to make day-to-day decisions, what happens when a person is not disciplined? Right, he makes careless decisions and he ends up hurting himself more than he ends up helping himself. Look at the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. His entire life is a story of what? Of discipline and deprivation. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala take him out from the house of Yaqub? Why?
Build them up.
But what was wrong with Yaqub? Yaqub wasn't doing a good job? Alayhi salam. What about his brothers? They were spoiled. It doesn't sound like they were spoiling him. They were jealous of him. If anything, if they were bullying him, though, that should have helped with that. But my question is, how do you think Yaqub's attitude was toward Yusuf? No, not Yaqub, his father.
Attached.
Right? He was not just attached. Yaqub came from a line of prophets, and he saw in Yusuf what? Signs of prophethood, and he was like, he's going to be the one. So what do you think very naturally happened? Right? He's going to be inclined toward him. And when an individual is inclined toward someone, what do they end up doing without ill intent? Giving them priority, giving them more attention. What we would call being spoiled. And what is a way to avoid or getting a child out of a spoiled environment? Sometimes you physically have to remove them. So what happened in this environment? Yusuf alayhi salam, what was the first thing that happened to him? He got thrown into a well, which probably was not a pleasant experience. And then he sat in that well for Allah knows how long. Then what happened? He got sold into slavery. After he was sold into slavery, what happened? Right, then he was seduced, but not just by anyone. Right, he was seduced by like the head or the queen or the prime minister or whatever you want to call her at the time. And then what happened? He was jailed. And then what happened? He was forgotten about, right? So he was jailed. Then one of his friends was getting out and he was like, yo, hey, remember me? Like, just keep me out. He's like, yo, I got you. And then what happened? A few years passed. And then he was like, oh yeah, there's this guy Yusuf in jail. Completely forgot about him. So all of this, what was the summary of it? What happened? It develops his character. Do you think Yusuf was a better, smarter, wiser person? Do you think it's easy to go and become an economic advisor of the state, just like that? Right, it requires somebody who has insight, somebody who has character, somebody who has strength. Another examples of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Right, his life wasn't easy. He was thrown into a fire pit, right, after being excommunicated by his family. Then how many times did he have to travel around? How many tests did he have to go through? And finally, the story of our beloved Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And how much adversity did he sallallahu alaihi wasallam actually have to face? How many family members did he lose? How much difficulty was there in his life that actually developed him and made him a strong person, made him a strong individual? So Ghazāli, he says that a person should not take pleasure in anything that he will not find in his grave. What do you guys think about that?
I've already lost that. What's the point?
So how do I actually do it? What are some things that we take pleasure in that we will not find in our grave? Like, what do we get? Everything. It's like everything. I was looking at this. I was like, bro, like, how do you do this? Like, how do you get to this point? So he said, except for immediate needs. Except for immediate needs. And what are those immediate needs? The things that you guys mentioned, it's like food, clothing, and shelter, right? These are the things that are the food, clothing, and shelter. So like these are the immediate needs that all of us have to face. These are the immediate things that all we need. And why do we need them? Just to survive. just to survive. He is pushing very much for a minimalist lifestyle. Very much for a minimalist lifestyle. Like, how do I apply this in my life? It's very important to keep this in the lens of all of these things being self-imposed. Can I impose this lifestyle on my family? No. Remember, this is all being self-imposed. However much I want to deprive myself, I have a right to do that, right? Unless, at what point can I stop depriving myself? Okay, when it's on, like when I'm bringing harm to myself, for sure. What else? When I bring harm to others. That's it. So these are the two criteria that we need to keep in mind, that I am allowed to deprive myself to the point that as long as I'm not bringing harm to myself and I'm not bringing harm to others, that I can continue doing that and I can continue depriving myself. So he's saying the path to salvation involves a few things. He says, number one, involves knowledge. A person needs to learn. He said it involves love, which is something that's extremely important and fundamental that we have talked about time and again. It involves meditation. What does he mean here by meditation? Dhikr, right? He's talking about dhikr here very specifically. And, you know, again, meditation to Allah, meaning dhikr. How are all these three things related, and what is so important about them, and why these three out of all the things that can be done? So what is the relationship between knowledge and this? Yes, go ahead. Okay, these are all things that are very personal. These are all very personal things. And when we talk about developing that personal relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that path is always going to be individual. How the salik seeks Allah is up to him, right? And it's a very personal path. Some people will lean more toward remembrance, they'll lean more toward dua, they'll lean more toward dhikr, and other people lean more toward seeking knowledge and learning. How an individual decides to approach that is completely up to him. So knowledge, what do we mean by knowledge here? Learning about? Learning about Allah, learning about the Prophet ﷺ, learning about the deen, right? This thing is something that's important. He mentions here love, but he doesn't mention fear. Why? I'm sorry?
It's both.
Because this encompasses both. This encompasses both. He's talking about loving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How do I increase my love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And this concept is something that is so fundamental. This is something that is so important. How do I develop a love for Allah? Right? Through his book. What does that mean? If I parrot the book, if my Arabic is, either my Arabic is poor or non-existent, how do I is reading the Quran in that way a way to better my relationship with Allah?
Listening.
Even listening.
You don't want to displease him.
I'm sorry. I'm saying reading the Quran, if I don't have a strong understanding of it, is that a means to further my love of him? Or is it a means of seeking blessing? It's a way of seeking blessing. But if I want to develop a meaningful relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what do I need to do? I need to ponder and spend time with what? The wording or the meaning? With the meaning. And this is the amazing thing about the Quran, that its message transcends even other languages, in that the meaning is something that is miraculous. Any meaning that we read and we come across is something that is going to touch our hearts. Every single one of us has read passages, has interacted with the Quran in different ways at different points in our lives where we have found ease in the difficulty that we were facing, or we found a message to help bring some solace to some of the problems that we're facing. And that is a way to increase our conviction, our yaqeen, which is directly tied to our belief, to our iman, and it also increases our love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The path to Allah, and I will reiterate this time and time again, is through loving him. And if I want to create that path for my wife, if I want to create that path for my children, if I want to create that path for my family, if I want to create it for my friends, for my community, I need to teach them what? I need to teach them love. And how do I do that? By spreading it and by expressing it, by the way I deal with people. If I'm kind with people and people learn how to actually love and be honest with one another, that once they understand this concept, it becomes that much easier for them to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It becomes that much easier for them to love the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. It becomes that much easier for them to love Deen al-Islam. And lastly, dhikr. What is the purpose of dhikr? remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we had talked about previously the different types of adhkar, right? We said adhkar are types. What are they? One is on the tongue. One is on the tongue. Other is on the, one is in the heart, right? In terms of pondering and remembering. And one is a combination of the two, where it's partially remembering on the tongue and partially remembering in the heart. Yeah.
I've heard there's a hadith where the Prophet Muhammad he enters into the masjid. There's like two circles.
Yeah.
A circle of knowledge, and then there's like a circle of people doing dhikr.
Yeah.
And he's decided to sit with the people
who are seeking knowledge.
Yeah. That signifies that we should value knowledge over dhikr. Like, what is the meaning behind that?
I mean, the meaning is to show that, number one, he didn't disapprove of either, right? That's the first thing to take away. He walked in, if he had a problem with one, he would have shunned one and he would have said something. And at that time, it's very possible that he sat down with the people who are seeking knowledge. Does it indicate preference? It would only indicate preference when he actually said something. And he said the majlis I'm sitting in is better than the other one. Or another thing he could have done is sat down with them and he could have called the people over and be like, listen, stop what you're doing and join this majlis. Did he do that? No. So again, it might have just been a personal preference thing at the time.
So it doesn't indicate like actual preference that we should value this or that.
No. Why? Because like I said, Yakhi, the way of the Sadiq, the one who's seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's love and pleasure, it is what? It's individual and it's personal. Forcing someone to seek knowledge when they don't have an inclination to it versus, allowing someone to go explore their dhikr, explore their wird, explore their dua. And both of these ways are very valid. Both of them are means to Allah.
Is it like better to just focus on one or like
which one do I focus on?
Whatever you're inclined to.
Whatever you're inclined to. You're learning, man. You're getting there, mashallah. Huh? Wasl. Khalas, wasl. You don't need this class anymore. Yeah. So, and that's something that's important to keep in mind. Listen, everybody's going to have an individual preference. Everybody's going to have an individual leaning. Those individual leanings and preferences need to be respected. And the only way I know that is if I do a self-exploration. I need to find out what it is that I'm inclined toward. And there might be some things that I am and some things that I'm not. But the only way for me to actually determine that is through discovery, is through exploration. So Ghazāli mentions 4 classes of people. Like some of the other discussions, this one's a little bit depressing, but he says the first is the Siddiqun, right? The Siddiqun. What do you think? These are like the top tier people. They don't care about the world, and all they do is spend their time just with the necessities of life and focusing on the things that bring them closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether it be seeking knowledge and teaching it, or whether it be adhkar and dua. They achieve the station by discipline and abstinence. And how do they do that? By shunning those things which they desire. The next is the superficial. What do you guys think about the superficial? What is this person doing? Huh? And so I wanted to believe that, but the problem is that this person, he remembers with the tongue only. No, he has the actions. What's the problem? It's not remembering his heart. Just to show the world. This person, he can be a hypocrite. This person can be somebody who's engrossed in riyā, right? In showing off his good deeds. And this type of person, all his deeds are destroyed. Allah protect us from that. So then he mentions 2 more types of people. And he said both of these people they're balanced, but one leans toward deen and the other one leans toward dunya. He said, as for the one who leans toward deen, well, he's only going to enter the hellfire for a small time. This is the person who leans toward deen, by the way. And then the person who leads toward dunya, he said, he's going to enter the hellfire too, just a little bit longer. So I was like, oh man, this is tough. I was like, oh, I don't, Allah protect us. But he then follows this with something important. He says, how can a person be punished for halal, right? And it's a valid question. If I am doing something that is halal, how can I be punished for that? He says that the people who say this, they're like, he's like, oh, that's a weak response. What kind of question is that? Because the reality is that he's talking about in the lens of excess. He's talking about israf. That even though an individual has an inclination toward the deen, he's still what?
Did mistakes.
Not just mistakes. We all make mistakes. That's not the problem. Yeah.
Unbalanced.
Right. He's still super unbalanced. Right. He's still super unbalanced. Even though he has the inclination toward the deen, he's still spending most of his life in excess. And the person who's leaning toward the dunya, yeah, he's spending more of his life in excess. So over here, this person, he's not actually balanced, right? He's not actually balanced. His excess is extremely high, but his deen is just a little bit behind. And this person, his deen is far behind. So after reading that, I was okay. Sure. Yeah, we have. Yeah, the mic is on. I think the camera is on.
It might have been the cable.
Okay, no, I think it started working. Is the blue light on the little box?
Yeah, it's on.
Okay. No, we're okay. Alhamdulillah.
Good? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, we're still recording.
Okay.
Close. Oops. So Ghazāli talks about involving yourself in the permissible and following those things that you desire. He said if an individual keeps falling into the permissible, what's going to happen? He's going to eventually fall into excess. And if an individual falls into excess, what happens is that he will fall eventually into the haram. And he's saying that this is the normal pathway. That the moment we allow ourselves to keep indulging in the permissible, we've now entered the state of excess. And now that I've extreme in my appetite has increased, it's not enough for me to keep consuming the halal. It's not enough. Because now my stomach is full on the halal. What do I want to do now? I want to increase more on that, so now I'm going to start entering into haram. And he says, وَمَا الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا لَعِبٌ وَلَهْوٌ. The life of this world is nothing but a game and distraction. What do you guys think about this verse? What do you think about this verse?
It exemplifies the reality of this world and the nature of this world.
I had one of my colleagues. He said, "You know why it's called dunya?" He said, "Lidaniyatiha." I really thought that was nice. He said it's called the dunya because it's something that's lowly. Lowly. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that this life, all it is a game and distraction. Why? Why is that? And what is it distracting us from? It's distracting us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's distracting us through the true goal, which is paradise and pleasing Allah. It's something that's very fundamental, something that's really important. He says it's just a game. And when you say something is just a game, what happens immediately is that it gives you perspective. And it gives you understanding on what the reality is of the world around us. And all of these things, and even many times when we look and we see competition between people who are on Wall Street, or between bankers, or between construction, like people who are building things, what do we see? And what do we say to ourselves? We're like, it's just a game. Like, is it really worth it? I remember yesterday I was extremely upset. I was very upset. I came to the masjid, and then I had to lead a janazah. And the moment I stood in front of the deceased, I completely forgot what I was angry about. And those moments are really important to help give us perspective. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exposes us to different things at different times to help remind us of who we are and what our place is. And this verse is a beautiful example of that. It's a beautiful example to tell us the reality of what this world is, what its value is, and how we should treat it. He gives some examples of indulgence. So he says indulgence of the tongue. What's an example you guys can think of? Right, so excessive talking, backbiting, he mentions it. So what do you think the solution for backbiting is? right? Talking good about people, that's one. He says another one. He says to actually shut up, right? He's like, just stop talking, like period, just stop talking. And this is a way, again, remember, we're talking about resetting that meter, trying to be between two extremes, right? Because the opposite of backbiting would be what? Right, not just right, like it's the opposite of backbiting, and on the other end of the spectrum would be to like being brutally honest, like being insulting, right? Because backbiting is behind somebody's back, and being insulting is something that you do in front of someone. So he's saying to develop that balance is to come back and to be silent. The eyes, I'm sure many of the guys have fallen into this one, right? is like obsessing ourselves with beauty and keep looking at beautiful things. And eventually, you know, when you see beautiful things, and going back to the example that he said, the halal things, the moment you keep indulging in them, what happens is that you lead into excess, and then that leads you into haram. You know, Allah protect us. So what does he say? What does an individual need to do? Right, he needs to show full restraint. It doesn't mean don't walk around with your eyes closed, huh? But but the idea is that you are supposed to show full restraint, and meaning try to keep your eyes lowered at all times, you know, as much as possible, so that an individual doesn't fall into this. And does this mean that we can't have normal relations with the opposite gender? You can, right? It's something that's very reasonable. A good example of this is like if I'm in line at Target, right, and there are two cashiers, both of them female, and I think one is attractive. What should I do? Right, I should go to the unattractive one, right? And because just because she's unattractive doesn't mean that she's actually unattractive. No, it just means that she's unattractive to me, because beauty is always going to be subjective. So there's a litmus test, and he talks to these people, arbab al-qulub. Arbab al-qulub are those individuals who actually have control and restraint over their hearts. So he says these individuals who actually have their reign over the heart, there are two things that happens. He said these people, they can fall into indulgence, or they fall into indulgence. And what happens to the adhkar? How does that affect their dhikr? How does that affect their remembrance? Right, so it starts to weaken. Right, it starts to weaken. And he said the opposite of this is deprivation. If an individual actually deprives himself, or she actually deprives herself, what do you think happens to that, to the adhkar and the dhikr at that point? Right, it actually strengthens. And sometimes we don't realize the effect of the world around us in our interaction with it. Because if we learn to actually restrain ourselves, we actually learn to deprive ourselves. This is a great way of furthering and strengthening our relationship, because dhikr is what? Is a path to gaining proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, gaining his love and getting closer to him. And this way is a way to strengthen that. He says that the way to do this is to gradually wean off worldly desires. And he actually likens this to a baby, right? So a baby, when a baby is first feeding, do you stop feeding immediately? No, it takes time. It takes time to wean the baby off of its mother's milk. So he said this is the same way we should wean ourselves off of our worldly desires. And he brings the example of a falcon, a child, and a riding animal in dealing with our nafs. Why does he use these three examples? Are there bad examples? I'm sorry? All right, to tame them, right? So a falcon, how do you tame a falcon? You guys have any idea? You actually put blinders on it. You put blinders. So you guys have ever seen those little leather covers that they put on the falcon? Right, so why do you think he used the falcon example? It was in his time. I mean, Ghazāli, he died 505. So they used it in his time because it was something that everybody was kind of familiar with. Like you guys had no idea how falcons are trained. So, so obviously it's not appropriate to our time. But the falcon, you actually put blinders on it. And this is the first step in order to train it. The child will kick, the child will scream. What do? You smack it, right? No, but you ignore it, right? You ignore the child until the child actually calms down. Because again, it's part of the training. And then lastly, the riding animal. Sometimes a horse, like a stallion, are they easy to train? No, they're extremely challenging. And he says all of these are similar to the nafs. Initially, for all of these, it's very easy or difficult? Initially, in the beginning. It's extremely difficult, right? To get all of these reared in, but once it's tamed, Once it's tamed, then it becomes easier, but it takes time. It takes time. So it's important that there are things that we love what we lose, right? Those things that are lost to us, we love them. So he says that in this world, it's important for us to keep in mind what are those things that we love. And how do we know that we love them is when we lose them. So he says that it's important to leave those things which can be lost by switching that to which is eternal and never ending, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, you know, making that switch, it can be a little bit challenging. It could be a little bit difficult, but like he said, with training, with discipline, with deprivation, that this is a way of actually replacing one love for another. But again, he will always caveat this. He will always surround this discussion with love and its importance. He talks about the path of discipline and struggle, saying that it starts with renouncement. That, you know, I renounce these ill qualities of myself. And what are you renouncing? You renounce your pleasures, right? Those things that you enjoy, those are the things that you actually have to renounce. Sometimes you succeed. Sometimes you succeed. And what do you do if you succeed? You go back in the cycle again, right? Because once I successfully deprive myself of one pleasure, what should I move on to? I should move on to the next one. Like, sometimes I fail. So he says that we should actually put ourselves in recluse. We should separate ourselves from all of those things. Anything that will bring me attraction, anything that I enjoy or anything I should desire, I should pull myself away from that. And how long do I keep doing this? Until I succeed, right? And then what happens? Then I go back, the cycle begins again. So these are a couple ways that he mentions on how to actually better ourselves, how to further ourselves, how to really purify our hearts. And these are actually very reasonable ways of taking care of that. And what is one of the best ways to practice khalwa? What are some of the best actions that I can do during that time when I'm spending time alone? Dhikr, right? Prayers, engaging with the Quran, like fasting, any good deeds that I enjoy. This is an excellent opportunity to take advantage of those. And that's it. This is the last part of the discussion that he mentions. Wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu ala khayri khalqin. Nabina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. If we have any related questions, we'll take them now, inshallah. Or if we have any unrelated questions, we can take them now. Usually people wait for the unrelated questions.
You know the hadith where it says pretty much the person sits down after pleasure and makes dhikr.
Yes. And until the sun sets, until the sun rises, yeah. He gets the reward of Umrah and Hajj tam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you say that's authentic to you?
No. No. Huh? Oh, no, I don't think the hadith is authentic. Any other questions? Sorry if I broke anybody's heart. But it doesn't mean you can't utilize that time. You understand? Like, that time is a blessed time. There's no doubt about it. And just because you don't have a specific hadith talking about a specific virtue at that time, we have general hadith that talk about the virtue of remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have general hadith talking about making adhkar at that time. We have general hadith about staying in the masjid, right? We have all of these hadith that talk about the virtues of those specific things. It doesn't mean you shouldn't utilize it, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He multiplies whatever He wills, however much He wills, for whoever He wills. It doesn't mean that we should stop seeking those times. It doesn't mean we should start seeking those things. And just because I feel a particular hadith isn't sound in concerning that, it doesn't mean that it still won't be counted in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And for those individuals who do it, maybe Allah will grant them what it is that they're looking for and seeking. Ameen.
The problem is the reward or the salah?
No, the problem is the isnad.
Salah.
Yeah.
About the salah.
About about this, like this specific reward. Yeah, mathabat. All of these, like I said, individually, all of these things are established. Praying shuruq, established. Making adhkar, established. Staying in the masjid, established. But this particular reward being associated with it, that's not something that is. Any other questions?
So if the two conditions are met, you consider probably
itself of not
Yeah.
harming others,
Yeah.
harming yourself.
Yeah.
Is there a point at where you can say that depriving yourself is actually not recommended or
Mhm.
bad?
Well, if you see yourself slipping. So what happens is a lot of times, like I'll give one example. If I indulge in a lot of foods, like a lot of different foods, and I start starving myself, right? I'm still healthy, and I'm not taking anybody else's right, but now in my heart, it's starting to become a chore. I don't feel like I'm gaining anything by starving myself. What do I do at that point? Right, I have to now I have to reanalyze. I have to reassess. Because nothing we do in our lives should ever feel like a chore. All of these things that we do should be fulfilling. And if I'm not, and like, just because I find something fulfilling today, it doesn't mean that I'm going to find it fulfilling tomorrow, right? We as people, we're constantly changing, we're growing, right? Like the way we are before we get married, the way we are after we get married, the way we are after having a few children, we're constantly changing, right? Our bodies are changing, like we're growing. And because of that growth, because of those changes, we constantly have to have this sense of mujahada. Like we constantly need to be striving to better ourselves. We constantly need to be striving to draw near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's not always going to be fixed. Just because I enjoyed adhkar when I was like, in high school, it doesn't mean that I'm going to enjoy it when I'm in my 40s, right? I might enjoy spending more time with the Quran. I might enjoy spending more time praying. I might enjoy spending more time, just alone and doing tadabbur and pondering over, Allah's creation. It's important that we, again, that self-exploration is something that is really fundamental and something that we all need to do. And the only way that I can find out what's good for me is by exposing myself to different types of adhkar, exposing myself to different types of worship. Anyone else? I guess everyone's tired.
Stuff is too hard.
It's too hard? La ilaha illallah. Yeah.
In terms of like balance and access.
Yeah.
In terms of like sharing knowledge, like a lot of times I'm pretty sure all of us, we've had like that person who's coming like makes sense doing like told us something knowledge like Islamically.
Yeah.
At what point is that like excess?
So it's always going to be excess when it comes to imposing. Remember, what did we say about all of these exercises? That they're what? That they're individual, right? In the moment I come in now and I'm imposing on someone else, well, that's not religion. That's not deen. Like, who am I to impose anything on anyone? If I can't force somebody to take shahada, which is probably the most important decision that anybody will make, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, La ikraha fi din, how can I do anything that's less than that? Enforcing someone, and the moment I force someone to do something, even if it's something they enjoy, what happens? Huh? They don't like it, right? If there's a even if there's a particular sandwich that I like, and you're like, no, you have to eat it right now. What happens? Like you don't want it. It's not. It doesn't have the same taste, right? Because now you personally don't have the freedom to desire it. So we should never impose. We should never impose. There's never a situation where we can impose our deen on someone else. We always have to make sure that whatever we're doing, it's our individual path to draw near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anything else? No. طيب جزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك واشهد ان لا اله الا انت واستغفرك واتوب اليك. Oh, yeah, I'll take a look, inshallah. I don't think there's anything, but yeah. No, there's nothing here.